pregnant drifter's gift to a cowboy unlocks a century-old secret. If you believe strangers can carry answers meant for you, comment, "The desert always remembers," and hit subscribe. This isn't just a Western tale. It's a buried truth waiting to rise. The afternoon sun hammered the red earth of Dusthaven like a blacksmith's forge, sending heat waves dancing across the barren landscape. Boone McKay sat on his porch, whittling a piece of cedar with slow, methodical strokes. Each curl of wood that fell to the weathered boards below marked another minute in a day that stretched endlessly toward evening. Dust kicked up on the horizon, a small cloud moving along the old trading road that hadn't seen much traffic since the silver mine played out 3 years back. Boone's knife paused mid-stroke. Visitors were rare in this forgotten corner of New Mexico territory, and those who came usually brought trouble. The figure emerged from the heat shimmer gradually, like a mirage solidifying into reality. A woman walked barefoot along the rutted path, her dress torn and stained with dust and something darker. Her belly swelled beneath the faded fabric, heavy with child. She moved with the careful gait of someone carrying precious cargo, one hand pressed against her lower back, the other clutching a rusted tin box against her chest. Boone set down his whittling and rose from the chair that had been his father's and his father's before that. The woman stumbled, caught herself, then continued, forward with determination that seemed to outweigh her obvious exhaustion. "Ma'am," he called out when she reached the gate to his property, "you look like you could use some water." She lifted her head, revealing a face burned bronze by the desert sun, but marked by an ethereal beauty that spoke of mixed blood. Perhaps Spanish and indigenous heritage blended into features both delicate and strong. Dark eyes met his across the dusty yard, holding depths that seemed to contain secrets older than the red rocks surrounding them. "Just need shelter for one night," she said, her voice carrying a slight accent he couldn't place. "Won't be any trouble." Boone studied her for a moment. The nearest town was a day's ride and sunset was approaching fast. The desert at night was no place for a pregnant woman, even one who seemed to possess an unusual strength. "The barn's clean," he said, gesturing toward the weathered structure behind the house. "Got fresh straw and a well nearby." "Much obliged." She stepped through the gate, moving with that same careful precision. As she passed close to him, Boone caught sight of the tin box she carried. It was old, older than anything he'd seen in these parts, with intricate engravings barely visible beneath layers of rust and wear. "That box looks heavy," he observed. The woman's grip tightened almost imperceptibly. "This doesn't belong to me," she said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "It belongs to this land." If that gave you chills, comment, she knew something. Evening painted the sky in shades of copper and gold as Boone watched the woman settle into the barn from his kitchen window. He'd brought her water, bread, and cold meat, simple fare, but better than whatever she'd been surviving on during her journey through the wasteland. The barn had been empty since his last horse died the previous winter, a victim of a harsh season that had claimed too much life in these forgotten lands. The barn door stood slightly ajar, lamplight spilling out in a golden rectangle that cut through the gathering darkness like a beacon calling to lost souls. Shadows moved within the weathered structure, and Boone found himself drawn by curiosity about the mysterious box and the woman who carried it, like a sacred relic passed down through generations of keepers. Unable to resist the pull of unanswered questions, he made his way across the yard on silent feet that had learned stealth during years of solitary hunting. The barn smelled of hay and horses, though the animal scents had faded to mere memories lingering in the wooden walls. Through a gap in the boards, worn smooth by decades of desert wind, he could see the woman sitting cross-legged on a pile of fresh straw he'd laid out for her comfort. The tin box lay open before her like an altar, displaying sacred objects. The lamplight, dancing with each small movement of air, revealed contents that made Boone's breath catch in his throat with recognition and dread. A hand-drawn map spread across her lap, yellowed with age and careful handling. The parchment showed landmarks he knew as well as his own reflection, the twin mesas to the east that stood like ancient sentinels watching over the valley, the dry creek bed that sometimes ran with flash floods during the rare summer storms, and most troubling of all, detailed markings that indicated caves in the cliff faces where his father had always forbidden him to venture. The cartography was exquisite, drawn with the precision of someone who had walked every mile of the territory being mapped. Symbols dotted the landscape, some recognizable as Spanish colonial markers, others bearing the distinctive geometric patterns of indigenous peoples who had called this land home long before white settlers arrived with their claims and their guns. Beside the map lay a silver locket, tarnished black in places but still bearing traces of intricate engravings that spoke of skilled craftsmanship and considerable expense. The woman opened it with reverent fingers that trembled slightly in the lamplight, revealing a daguerreotype of a young child, a girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, with solemn dark eyes that seemed to look directly out of the past with an expression of infinite sadness. The child wore traditional indigenous clothing, carefully detailed in the photograph despite the limitations of early camera technology. Beadwork adorned her dress, and small silver ornaments caught what light the daguerreotype could capture. But it was her eyes that held Boone transfixed. They seemed familiar somehow, as if he'd seen them before in dreams or half-remembered childhood nightmares. But it was the letter that made his world tilt on its axis. The paper was thick and cream-colored, the kind that wealthy folk used for important correspondence, with a watermark that spoke of quality and permanence. The woman unfolded it, with the careful reverence of someone handling scripture, as if afraid the ancient paper might crumble at her touch and take its secrets with it into dust. The handwriting was masculine, educated, and formed with the careful precision of someone accustomed to recording important matters, but the words themselves shook with emotion that had somehow transferred itself to the very ink, leaving traces of desperation and guilt that had survived more than a century. "To a Mackay yet unborn," she read aloud, her voice carrying across the still night air like a prayer spoken in an empty church. "From one who seeks forgiveness for sins that have stained this red earth with innocent blood. May God have mercy on what we have done in the name of progress and civilization." Boone's whittling knife clattered to the ground where he'd been unconsciously gripping it, the sound sharp as gunfire in the desert silence. The woman's head snapped up, her dark eyes finding his through the gap in the boards with the accuracy of someone who had been expecting discovery. "You heard," she said. It wasn't a question but a statement of fact, as if she had been waiting for this moment since her arrival. "Mackay's my name," Boone said, stepping into the circle of lamplight that seemed to hold them both like actors on a stage. "How'd you come by that letter?" The woman folded the paper carefully, treating it with the same reverence she might show a relic from a saint, and placed it back in the box among the other mysterious artifacts. "My grandmother gave this to me when she was dying 3 months ago. Said it belonged to the Red Cliffs, and that someday I'd know when the time came to return it to where it belonged." "Your grandmother?" "Maria Santos. Some called her a curandera, a healer who could mend both body and spirit. Others called her a witch who spoke with the dead." The woman's hand moved protectively over her swollen belly, where new life grew despite the harsh circumstances of her journey. She said this box held the key to an old wound that needed healing before it poisoned the land forever. Boone moved, closer, drawn by a compulsion he couldn't name. "What's the date on that letter?" 1783. The number hit him like a physical blow. His great-grandfather had come to this territory in 1783, one of the first white settlers to establish a permanent homestead in the area. Family stories spoke of conflicts with local tribes, but the details had always been vague, wrapped in the kind of silence that suggests shame. "If a letter from the past came with your name, would you read it?" Comment: "I would." Dawn broke, blood red over the mesa tops, painting the desert in shades that matched the ancient stories whispered around campfires. Boone had slept little, his mind turning over the contents of the tin box and the implications they carried. The woman was awake when he brought coffee and biscuits to the barn, sitting upright despite the obvious discomfort of her condition. The tin box lay closed beside her, but its presence filled the space like a held breath. "The map," Boone said without preamble. "Those cave markings. My father used to say they were dangerous. Unstable rock, he claimed." "Your father knew," she replied, accepting the coffee with grateful hands. just as mine knew and his father before him. The truth has a way of passing down through generations, even when we try to bury it. What truth? Instead of answering, directly she opened the box again and withdrew the map. In the morning light, additional details became visible, symbols that clearly belonged to indigenous cartography, marking sacred sites and burial grounds with the reverence of a people who understood that some places held the spirits of the dead. There, she pointed to a cluster of symbols near the cave markings. The place where a child was taken from her people, where promises were broken and blood was shed in the name of gold and land. Boone studied the map, recognizing landmarks with growing unease. The area she indicated lay in the shadow of Eagle's Tooth, a distinctive rock formation that had served as a boundary marker for the Mackay property since his great-grandfather's time. You're saying my family? I'm saying this box came to me for a reason. Just as you bearing the name Mackay isn't coincidence. She folded the map carefully. Some debts pass from father to son until someone chooses to pay them. The weight of generations settled on Boone's shoulders like a stone mantle. He'd always known there were dark corners in his family's history, places where the stories stopped and silence began. His father had died 2 years ago, taking those secrets to his grave. His younger brother Jack had been killed in a mining accident the year before that, leaving Boone as the last of the Mackay line. The caves, he said finally. You think that's where the answers are? I think that's where the reckoning is. Boone looked out across the red landscape toward the distant cliffs. Something cold moved in his chest, not fear exactly, but the recognition that some paths once started couldn't be abandoned. I'll saddle my horse, he said. The ride to Eagle's Tooth took 2 hours across terrain that seemed designed by a vengeful god to break both horse and rider. Ancient arroyos cut deep scars across the landscape, their walls carved by flash floods that came perhaps once in a decade, but left permanent reminders of water's power over stone. Sagebrush and barrel cactus dotted the red earth like nature's own obstacles, forcing constant detours around thorns that could cripple a horse or rider careless enough to ignore their warnings. Boone led the way on his sturdy chestnut mare, a reliable animal that had carried him through countless miles of unforgiving country. Behind him, Eleanor rode his father's old paint gelding with the natural grace of someone born to the saddle, despite the obvious discomfort of her advancing condition. Her hands rested easy on the reins, but Boone caught her occasional winces as the horse's gait jarred her swollen body. The sun climbed higher as they rode, turning the desert air into a furnace that shimmered with heat waves. Sweat darkened their clothes and made the horses' coats gleam like polished leather. But Elena never complained, never asked to rest, riding, with the same determined focus that had carried her across hundreds of miles of wasteland to reach this place. Eagle's Tooth rose from the desert floor like a massive stone finger pointing accusingly at the heavens. The formation was visible from 20 miles away on clear days, a landmark that had guided travelers and war parties alike for centuries before white men ever set foot in the territory. Ancient pictographs covered its lower reaches, spiral patterns, and human figures that spoke of spiritual significance to the peoples who had first called this land sacred. The caves opened like dark mouths in the cliff face beneath the towering spire, their entrances partially hidden by centuries of rockfall and the stubborn growth of desert plants that somehow found purchase in the harsh environment. Boone had passed this way many times in his youth, always hearing his father's voice warning him away from the unstable rocks that might collapse and trap an unwary explorer. Now, studying the cave mouths with adult eyes, he could see that the rockfall wasn't natural erosion, but deliberate. Someone had tried to seal these openings, using hammer and chisel to bring down stone barriers that would discourage casual exploration. The work was old, probably decades old, but recent enough to be clearly intentional. Elena dismounted carefully, one hand pressed against her lower back where the long ride had awakened aches that spoke of labor approaching sooner than either of them had anticipated. Her breathing had changed during the ride, becoming more controlled and deliberate in a way that made Boone's pulse quicken with recognition of impending birth. "You should wait here," he said, studying her pale face and the way she moved with increasing caution. "Let me go first and see what's inside. This isn't your burden to bear alone. she replied, pulling a torch from her saddlebag with hands that trembled slightly. Some truths require witnesses. My grandmother told me that secrets die in darkness, but truth grows stronger when shared. The largest cave entrance stood 7 feet high at its peak, worn smooth by centuries of wind and water that had carved the opening into an almost perfect arch. Ancient tool marks were still visible in the stone, evidence that human hands had worked to enlarge the natural opening, creating a doorway that could accommodate groups of people moving through the sacred space. Boone struck a match and lit Elena's torch, then lit one of his own. The flames pushed back shadows that seemed reluctant to retreat, as if darkness itself had claimed these depths and resented the intrusion of light. The air that flowed from the cave mouth carried scents of minerals and age, but underneath those familiar cave smells lay something else, something that spoke of sorrow and death and things left too long undisturbed. Their footsteps echoed off stone walls as they moved deeper into the mountain's heart, following a passage that descended at a gentle angle toward chambers carved by water over geological ages. The torch flames danced with each movement of air, creating shifting patterns of light and shadow that seemed to bring the cave walls to life with movement that existed only in peripheral vision. Elena moved beside him with surprising steadiness despite her condition, her torch held high to illuminate. Petroglyphs that covered the passage walls. The ancient artwork told stories in symbols and figures, hunting scenes, spiritual ceremonies, family groups gathered around fires that had burned to ash centuries before their ancestors were born. The passage opened into a natural chamber large, enough to hold a small house, its ceiling lost in shadows beyond the reach of their torches. Boone raised his flame higher and felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Bones lay scattered across the cave floor, human bones, yellowed with age but arranged with the careful attention of someone who had tried to provide proper burial despite circumstances that prevented traditional ceremonies. Small bones lay, grouped together, clearly belonging to children, while larger adult skeletons surrounded them in protective circles that spoke of final moments spent shielding the innocent from violence. A wooden cross stood sentinel over the grisly scene, crude but lovingly carved from what appeared to be oak, wood that would have been precious in this desert land and transported from far away at considerable effort. The craftsmanship spoke of someone who had taken time and care despite circumstances that must have been desperate. Each curve and angle shaped with reverence for the dead it was meant to honor. On the walls surrounding the burial chamber, painted in pigments that had somehow survived more than a century of desert air and seeping moisture, were symbols and images that told a story no white man's history book would ever record. The artwork covered every available surface, creating a gallery of grief and remembrance that spoke in the universal language of loss. Human figures danced across the stone surfaces, warriors with traditional weapons, women with children, scenes of daily life interrupted by violence. But it was the central mural that drew Boone's attention with magnetic force. A small figure in white stood between two groups of armed men, her arms outstretched, as if trying to bridge the gap between them. Around her, red paint depicted what could only be blood, spreading like spilled water across the cave floor. "Dear God," Boone whispered, his voice barely audible in the sacred space. Elena moved among the bones with reverence that bordered on the spiritual, her torch revealing details that painted an increasingly clear picture of tragedy and betrayal. Small bones, a child's bones, lay in the place of honor beneath the wooden cross, arranged with the careful attention that spoke of love transcending death. The skull was small, delicate, belonging to someone who had barely begun to experience life before violence cut short her time in the world. Larger skeletons surrounded the child's remains, positioned as if they had died defending something precious beyond their own lives. These were adult bones, strong and well-formed, belonging to people who had known hard work and physical challenges. War paint still clung to some of the skulls in faded traces of red and yellow, speaking of warriors who had gone to their deaths in full ceremonial dress. But it was the arrangement itself that spoke most powerfully to anyone with eyes to see. This wasn't the random scatter of bones that time and scavengers would leave behind. Someone had gathered these remains with infinite care, laying them out according to relationships and respect. Parents close to children, warriors arranged according to rank and honor, everyone positioned to face the painted wall where their story was told in images that would outlast the memories of the living. "The inscription," Eleanor said, pointing to words carved into the stone wall behind the cross with trembling fingers that barely maintained their grip on the torch. "Can you read it?" Boone moved closer, holding his torch steady despite hands that shook with the enormity of what he was witnessing. The words were in English, carved with what appeared to be a knife or chisel wielded by hands that trembled with either grief or guilt, perhaps both. The letters were uneven, some deeper than others, as if the carver had been forced to stop and restart multiple times. "Here lies little Star, daughter of Swift Eagle, taken from her people by greed and fear. May God forgive us for what we have done. The child is the bridge." Below the primary inscription, in a different hand and clearly added at a later time, were more words carved with the same trembling uncertainty. "Swift Eagle and his warriors, who died seeking justice for the innocent. May their spirits find peace when the debt is paid." And at the bottom, in letters so faint they were barely visible, a final line that seemed to have been added most recently of all. "The bridge will come when the desert blooms with new life." Boone's legs gave out, as if someone had cut the strings that held him upright, and he sank to his knees among the ancient bones. The torch trembled in his hand like a leaf in wind, as pieces of family history, whispered conversations he'd overheard as a child, his father's nightmares that had echoed through the house on sleepless nights, the way certain topics always changed. The subject, when he asked too many questions, fell into place with horrible clarity. The silence in the cave seemed to press against his eardrums like the weight of accumulated years. Every shadow held accusations. Every flicker of torchlight revealed new details of the tragedy that had unfolded in this sacred space. The bones seemed to watch him with empty sockets that still held the power to judge the living. "My great-grandfather," he said, his voice barely audible even in the perfect acoustics of the cave chamber, "he took a child. And when her father came to reclaim her, your people killed them all." Elena's voice held no judgment, only the bone-deep sadness of someone who had carried this knowledge as a burden for too long. "But someone had a conscience. Someone with your blood running in their veins buried them with honor and carved that confession into living stone." Eleanor's hand moved to her belly with sudden urgency, and her breathing changed in a way that made Boone's attention snap back to the present moment. The torch in her hand wavered as a contraction gripped her body. "The child is the bridge," Boone read again, the words taking on new meaning as he watched Elena struggle with the approaching birth. "What does that mean?" Elena's free hand gripped the cave wall for support as another wave of pain washed over her. When she looked at him, her eyes held knowledge that seemed to span generations. "Some bridges span more than rivers, Boone McKay. Some bridges span time itself, connecting what was broken to what can be healed. If redemption matters more than pride, comment, the child deserves peace." They emerged from the caves as storm clouds gathered over the mesas, turning the afternoon sky the color of old blood. Elena moved slowly, her breathing shallow and controlled in a way that made Boone's pulse quicken with recognition. "How long?" he asked. "Since this morning," she admitted, leaning against her horse. "But the baby knows. She wants to be born here, where the circle can be closed." I've known since the beginning. Just as I've known she was meant for this place this time." Eleanor's face contorted briefly as a contraction gripped her. "There's something else. Something I need to show you before—" She reached into the tin box with trembling fingers and withdrew the silver locket. In the strange light of the approaching storm, Boone could see details he'd missed before, tiny engravings around the edge that weren't decorative flourishes, but actual words in a script he didn't recognize. "Open it," Elena said, pressing the locket into his hands. Boone found the catch and pressed it. The locket opened to reveal not just the daguerreotype of the child, but a hidden compartment behind it. Inside lay a second piece of paper, folded small and brown with age. The writing was different from the first letter, feminine, careful, written in Spanish with some words in what appeared to be Navajo. Elena translated in a voice strained by pain and emotion. "To the man who will help birth the bridge, little. Star forgives what was done. Her spirit has been waiting for the circle to close. for life to come where only death remained. When the child is born in the place of sorrow, the debt will be paid, and the spirits can rest. Thunder rolled across the desert as Elena doubled over with another contraction. "The chapel," she gasped. "There's an old chapel near the caves. I saw it on the map." Boone knew the place, a crumbling adobe structure his family had avoided for generations, claiming it was unsafe. Now he understood the real reason for their avoidance. It had been built over the original burial site, an attempt to consecrate ground that had been stained with innocent blood. Elena couldn't ride anymore. Boone lifted her onto his horse and led both animals toward the ruins of the chapel. His mind racing with the implications of what was happening. This woman had traveled across hundreds of miles of desert, carrying a century-old secret and a child whose birth would somehow pay a debt he'd never known his family owed. The chapel stood against the darkening sky like a broken promise. 3 walls remained intact, their adobe surfaces scarred by wind and rain. The roof had long since collapsed, leaving the interior open to the elements. Wildflowers grew among the rubble, the same varieties that bloomed on indigenous burial grounds throughout the southwest. Elena slid from the horse and walked to the center of the ruins with purpose that transcended her physical condition. "Here," she said, sinking to her knees on ground that was softer than it should have been, enriched by generations of decay and renewal. "She wants to be born here." Boone had helped with enough ranch births to know the basics, but this felt different, charged with significance that went beyond the simple mechanics of delivery. As Elena's labor intensified, he found himself praying to gods he wasn't sure he believed in, asking for forgiveness for sins he hadn't committed but had inherited nonetheless. Lightning split the sky as the child crowned, and thunder shook the ancient walls as she drew her first breath. Boone caught the baby in trembling hands, marveling at the perfection of tiny fingers and toes, the way her dark eyes seemed to look directly at him with ancient wisdom. "Tallulah," Elena whispered, her voice weak but triumphant. "Her name is Tallulah. It means blessed water in the old tongue." As if summoned by the child's cry, rain began to fall, the first real rain the desert had seen in months. It washed the dust from the chapel ruins and turned the dry creek beds into rushing streams that sang with the voices of the departed. The storm passed before dawn like a cleansing spirit, moving across the land, leaving the desert washed clean and glittering with moisture that caught the first rays of sunlight like scattered diamonds cast across red earth. The air smelled different, fresher, somehow purified by the violence of wind and rain that had swept away the accumulated dust and sorrow of decades. Boone sat against the crumbling adobe wall of the chapel, his back pressed against stone that still held the coolness of the night. Baby Tallulah lay cradled in his arms, wrapped in his shirt and a blanket Elena had produced from somewhere in her meager possessions. The child was perfect in the way that only newborns can be, 10 tiny fingers that gripped with surprising strength, 10 perfect toes that moved with the random dance of new life, and a head covered with dark hair that caught auburn highlights in the morning sun streaming through the chapel's broken roof. But it was her eyes that held Boone transfixed, refusing to release his gaze even when practical concerns demanded his attention. They were dark eyes, impossibly wise for someone who had drawn breath for less than 6 hours. More unsettling still, they were familiar eyes, the exact eyes from the daguerreotype in the silver locket, as if little Star herself had returned to finish business left undone for more than a century. Elena rested on a bed of blankets and horsetack that Boone had arranged with the desperate efficiency of a man learning midwifery through necessity. Exhaustion painted shadows beneath her eyes, but her face held the particular glow that came to women who had successfully navigated the treacherous passage between carrying life and delivering it safely into the world. Her breathing had returned to normal rhythms, though she moved with the careful precision of someone whose body had been transformed by recent trauma. "She's beautiful," Boone said, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't begin to name or understand. The words seemed inadequate for what he was holding, not just a baby, but somehow a bridge between past and future, guilt and redemption, death and renewal. Eleanor smiled with an expression that mixed exhaustion and joy in proportions that spoke of profound transformation. She's the bridge, can't you feel it? The weight that's been lifted from this place. Boone could feel something, a lightness in his chest that he hadn't experienced since childhood, as if a burden he'd carried without, knowing it had suddenly been removed by invisible hands. The desert around them seemed different too, more alive somehow, as if the rain had awakened spirits that had been sleeping restlessly in the red earth for generations. Even the ruined chapel felt different, less haunted and more blessed, as if the very stones had been cleansed, continuing on urgent business. Somewhere nearby he could hear the trickle of water running in what had been a dry creek bed for as long as he could remember. "What happens now?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer would change. Everything about the life he'd built in isolation. "Now you choose," Elena said, shifting carefully to a more comfortable position among the blankets. "You can let us go pretend this never happened and live with the knowledge of what your family did, or you can help us heal this land properly, give Little Star the burial she deserved, honor the warriors who died seeking justice for their child, and raise the bridge that will span the years between past and future." Boone looked down at baby Tallulah, who had wrapped her tiny fist around his finger with the unconscious strength that all newborns possess. The grip felt like a promise, a connection that went beyond the simple mechanics of infant reflexes. The choice Elena offered wasn't really a choice at all. Some debts could only be paid with love, and some wounds could only heal when the right hands tended them with proper care. The morning sun climbed higher as they prepared for the work that needed doing. Eleanor remained with the baby, while Boone made multiple trips to the cave, carefully gathering the ancient bones and bringing them to the chapel ruins where they belonged. Each trip felt like a pilgrimage, a journey between the darkness of hidden guilt and the light of acknowledged truth. He worked with reverence that surprised him, handling each bone as if it were made of the finest porcelain rather than calcium, hardened by time and sorrow. The remains of Little Star came first, cradled in his arms with the same care he would show a living child. Her bones were small and light, speaking of a life cut short before it could reach full flowering. The warriors followed, Swift Eagle and his men, brave souls who had died seeking justice for the innocent and found only more violence in return. Their bones spoke of strength and purpose, of lives lived according to honor codes that white civilization had never bothered to understand before destroying them. As the sun reached its zenith, casting sharp shadows among the chapel ruins, Boone began the work of proper burial. He carved a new marker from red sandstone, using tools borrowed from Elena's seemingly inexhaustible supply of necessary items. The stone was hard work, requiring patience and strength that tested muscles grown soft from years of solitary ranch work. Elena helped with the inscription, teaching him words in Spanish and what she claimed was the old Navajo tongue. The marker, when finished, bore messages in 3 languages: English for the living who would come after, Spanish for the colonial heritage that had shaped this land, and symbols that honored the indigenous peoples who had been here first and longest. As the sun reached its zenith, Elena placed the silver locket on Little Star's grave and spoke words in the old tongue that seemed to make the air itself shimmer with release. Boone added his own prayer, asking forgiveness not just for his ancestors, but for all the sins that men committed when fear and greed overcame their humanity. The ceremony was simple but profound. When it was finished, baby Tallulah opened her eyes and made a sound that wasn't quite a cry, more like a sigh of contentment, as if she too felt the circle closing. "Will you stay?" Boone asked Elena as they prepared to leave the sacred place. "For a while," she said. "Tallulah needs time to grow, and this land needs time to heal, but someday we'll move on. The bridge, once built, doesn't need builders to maintain it." They rode back to the ranch in comfortable silence, 3 souls connected by threads of destiny that stretched across generations. Behind them, the chapel ruins stood peaceful in the afternoon sun, no longer haunted by the ghosts of broken promises, but blessed by the presence of justice finally served. That evening, as Elena nursed baby Tallulah on the front porch, Boone planted wildflower seeds around the graves of his father and brother. For the first time since their deaths, he could think of them without the crushing weight of unresolved guilt. The sins of the fathers had been acknowledged and atoned for, The future could begin with clean hands and an open heart. 6 months later, baby Tallulah gurgled and laughed as Boone bounced her on his knee, while Elena prepared supper in the kitchen that had known only a man's cooking for too long. The house felt different now, fuller, warmer, alive with the sounds. The family. Elena had stayed through the winter, and spring had brought changes to the land that even long-time residents remarked upon. The old creek bed ran with clear water year-round now, and flowers bloomed in places where nothing had grown for decades. Travelers passing through spoke of feeling an unusual peace in the area, as if the desert itself had been healed of some ancient wound. The tin box sat on the mantelpiece now, its contents preserved but no longer secret. Boone had written his own letter to be added to the collection, an account of what had transpired, addressed to future generations who might need to remember that redemption was always possible for those brave enough to face the past. "She's getting heavy," Eleanor observed, watching Boone struggle to keep up with Tallulah's increasingly active play. "Growing like a desert flower after rain," Boone agreed. "Strong and beautiful and meant for this place." Helena's hand moved unconsciously to her belly, where new life had begun to stir. She hadn't told Boone yet, but she would soon. This child, too, was meant for the healing land, a brother or sister for Tallulah, another thread in the web of redemption that was weaving itself across the red earth of Dusthaven. As the sun set over the mesas, painting the sky in shades of promise, Boone carried Tallulah to the window and pointed toward the chapel ruins in the distance. The structure was barely visible in the gathering dusk, but somehow its presence could be felt. No longer a monument to shame, but a shrine to the power of love to overcome the sins of the past. "See that, little one?" he whispered to the child who carried the soul of her ancestor. "That's where your story began, where all our stories began again." Tallulah reached toward the window with chubby fingers, as if she could touch the sacred place where she had been born. In her dark eyes, Boone saw not just the wisdom of Little Star, but the hope of all the children yet to come. Children who would grow up free from the burden of inherited guilt, rooted in soil that had been watered, with tears of repentance, and blessed with the promise of redemption. The desert wind carried the scent of rain and wildflowers as night settled over the land like a gentle embrace. In the distance, coyotes sang their ancient songs to the stars, but their voices held no loneliness now, only the joy of spirits, finally at peace. If this story touched your heart, comment, "Some gifts are meant for the soul," and subscribe now, because every stranger in the West carries a story worth hearing.